So moving on to the concept of nature worship, which is part of the Celtic philosophy and religion. I think we're going to move on to the ancestor worship and the sacrifice next time. But the actual nature worship side of things, supposedly they believed that the gods and goddesses lived in the natural world and they could be found in rivers, mountains, and other natural features. This is something that happens in lots of other religions as well, this sort of personification of the natural world. Shinto is a good example, where they say there's a river spirit. So it seems like a natural impulse of early humans, in my opinion, in that because it's found cross-culturally in many instances, not in all cultures obviously, but it seems like there is an impulse to anthropomorphise features of the natural world.
Definitely. I know that one of the tribes around modern Paris, the Parisi, they worshipped a deity of the mouth of the River Seine. It had its own deity, for example.
Yeah, I read about that as well, actually. So many Celtic burial sites have been found with animal bones and plants deliberately placed alongside human remains. Obviously, this implies some sort of significance and places the buried person alongside these other things. So the plants and animals, they must be significant in some way. And I think that the idea being that in the afterlife they can take these plants and animals with them to survive. That's what they believed, because that's normally why people buried the dead with objects, wasn't it? In many cultures, I mean, the Egyptian pharaohs, among many, many others.
Scythians had giant burial mounds and all the precious things were buried with them. Even sometimes your wives and servants were...
Well, the Indians were known for that, weren't they, before we put a stop to it?
Were walled up with you. Yeah, right. Yeah. All your widows are burnt alive, yeah. Sure.
It's quite a horrifying prospect, really, isn't it? Of course, they had many sacred natural sites as well. Many of them are lost to history, although I know one was the site of the Roman baths in Bath, believe it or not, which were built upon a sacred natural hot spring that was very important to the people who lived there. Before the Romans built quite an amazing bath on top of it, to be fair, although I imagine that would have been sacrilegious to the people who actually lived there originally.
Yeah, what have you done? What have you built on top of...
Imagine...
I mean, it looks quite nice and it's better than what we had, but this was sacred ground. What have you done here?
I like the idea of you going to like a church and then turning it into like a swimming pool or like a hot tub. It would have been more like a hot tub for Romans.
Yeah.
It's like going to the Vatican and turning it into a nightclub or something.
Although it's interesting that actually the Celts quite often had done that to previous cultures. Because there were cultures in Britain before the Celts, like the Bell Beaker people. The civilization, whoever built Stonehenge, they're not Celts, they were long before the Celts. The Celts would come along and find their burial mounds, their barrows, and appropriate them. So the Celts did it to even older people. It's an ongoing thing.
I imagine that the people that they took over from had a bit more in common with them than the Romans did, though, because that sort of clash of cultures didn't really happen to that scale as, say, a Roman invasion force, I would imagine, at the very least. Most people who would have been coming to the British Isles would have been living in France or Belgium or Holland, maybe, somewhere around that coast, you would imagine. Maybe. That's only a guess.
Possibly, yeah. I think that movement in the ancient world or in the prehistory was a bit more than you might expect.
Well, yeah, they certainly had...
like people from Corsica or Turkey turning up in Britain, for example.
We know that they had the Celtic world. They all traded amongst each other. So basically all of the Atlantic European side certainly traded with one another. But we found Etruscan pottery in Britain.
Right.
So it goes to show that there was a pretty extensive trade network throughout a decent amount of Europe going on.
Just the other day I saw that they dug up a Roman artefact which was identical to one from Syria. for example, or the Sutton Hoo treasures. There's certain gems and garnets and things that may be as far away as Afghanistan or India.
Mm-hmm.
So incredible.
It's amazing,
to think
really, isn't it?
that. Yeah.
I think the world is a lot more interconnected than people might assume, even though you didn't, get these massive hundreds and thousands of people.
It might be a very small number of people making these giant journeys, but still, they did happen, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, yeah.
It's a shame we don't have more accounts on it, because things like the accounts of Marco Polo and things like that, obviously that's much, much later and an entirely different period of history. But to know their perspective on these things that we know as sort of isolated from that time frame, it's amazing. It's like those Japanese accounts of Victorian England when they first came over here to the Western world. I always find them so interesting because they're so removed from our culture.
It's funny you should mention Marco Polo, for example. The first European, an Italian man, went to the first person to go to China and back. No, not at all, not close, nowhere near. I mean, he might be one of the first to have it well documented. Even Marco Polo might have been making a lot of it up. But the point is that from prehistory, there will be some connection from the middle of Asia or even Far East to Europe.
I mean, the Silk Road had been going for such a long time, hadn't it? That
Right.
who was going along those roads? It wasn't just nobody, was it?
The first time it's documented doesn't mean it was the first time. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yes, absolutely.
And it would have been probably almost certainly a very small number of people that ever did it. But nevertheless, it happened. It must have.
Back to the nature worship side of things. Obviously, they would have been very dependent on plants and the natural world, so that they would be dependent on things like cereals, things like legumes, like peas, beans, lentils, root vegetables such as carrots and turnips and parsnips, because they were easy to grow and kept quite well. Berries such as blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, which obviously grow wild, so they don't even need to cultivate them themselves, and herbs, rosemary, thyme, mint, for cooking and medicinal purposes, and of course trees. So the oak, the ash, the yew, which we use for things like construction and making tools. So just the fact that they relied on nature so much to live, I think, plays a very big part in their nature worship, in that all aspects of life were somewhat, even if it's indirectly, interfacing through nature. And it makes sense that they had such reverence for nature when it was the thing that determined the quality of their life in the first place.
You mentioned earlier animal husbandry. Mm-hmm. They weren't sort of, certainly weren't nomadic or anything like that. So
no.
They did husband their animals. Perhaps now can briefly mention the sort of wattle and daub roundhouses. Famously, the Celts, if people know a bit about it, they all lived in roundhouses. Well, no, it seems like the Galli or the Gauls, the French Celts, very rarely lived in round houses. They lived in rectangular buildings.
I've seen them. I've seen the settlements in the flesh on Dartmoor, like the remnants of them. You can see they're very small buildings, to be honest. You could barely sleep a couple of people in them a lot of the time.
But then I was going to say, in some places in Britain and in northern Spain, like the Iberian Celts, they were more likely, but by no means always, but they were more likely to build roundhouses. But just say, like I have said a few times, all the Celts lived in roundhouses. Well, no, they didn't. for over 1,000 years, all of them did that. No, that's too low resolution, if you like.
There's also the fact that a roundhouse is very difficult to build in
especially
relation to a rectangular structure. It's much easier if you're using wood or even mud bricks to build something that's
wattle and daub.
Yeah.
Or something. Yeah.
So making something round is actually quite advanced in a way.
And if it's big, if it's supposed to be a big area like the chieftain's tent or some sort of communal hall, a really big roundhouse, that's quite technically fairly difficult.
I think round structures tend to be more temporary. Like I'm thinking of like teepee tents or sort of Mongol style tents where they're tall and sort of spherical as well, if you know the ones I mean. It's a much better structure if you're not staying put than if you are. So of course, as well, building a roof on top of that circular thing is very difficult, and also it's not great if, say, it's snowing, because you're going to want a very steep roof to keep the snow off. But enough of that. Okay. Moving on to the, I think it's Coligny, somewhere in France, calendar, which is a lunar solar calendar, and here is the archaeological what's left of it anyway. So I think this whole thing spans about 4 foot, and this is dated from the 2nd century AD. So this is after the Roman conquest. So it's written in Latin, but is a form of Gallic language, which I didn't realise there was this sort of syncretism. But this was found in 1897 in Coligny, France. So this describes a calendar with a 5-year cycle of 62 months. And this was used to basically decipher what the ancient Celtic calendar was, because lots of ancient Roman historians, if it's fair to call them that, but basically people who had to say stuff about the Celts always complimented their knowledge of the stars. Right. And it seems to be that the calendar had featured weeks, which were 5 days, and each month had 6 weeks. So it's either 29 or 30 days. And they would have 12 months in a year, which would total 354 days. But because of this, obviously, our modern calendars don't have 354 days. So they had to accommodate for a drift. So the calendar would drift out of sync by a day each year, but this could be dealt with by dropping a month every 30 years, which we believe was the easiest way for them to do this. So each Celtic month started on the 6th day of the lunar cycle, according to Pliny the Elder, which happens to be the date of the quarter moon, which is the easiest date to confirm by direct observation. So it seems like they had quite a sophisticated calendar, one that you could look up to the sky and confirm what day you're on. And it seems to be relatively functional as well. I mean, this is before even the Julian calendar, which of course Julius Caesar, with the help of, I can't remember, someone of Alexandria, helped him come up with it, a mathematician.
Ptolemy?
I can't remember his name. Never mind, I'm really stretching for it there. But the Julian calendar was used up until even the early 20th century in Russia, before it was replaced by the Gregorian calendar, which is the one we use. But it's not too far off.
It was replaced around the age of Newton.
We were an early adopter.
Gregorian calendar, right. Mm-hmm. The Julian calendar is taken from Julius Caesar. He was the one who adopted it. But I think, even the people that came before the Celts, the culture, the people that were responsible for Stonehenge, for example, even in those days, they had quite a sophisticated view of the heavens, with sort of recumbent stones and cycles of the moon, and paying very, very close attention to the stars. And how the planets move. They didn't know there were planets, but how there's certain moving stars moved across the sky, and how you could sort of map the year a year out using that, and how the North Star or certain stars didn't move, and all sorts of things. The Celts certainly were no slouches.
It amazed me at how sophisticated their calendar was, to be honest, because you think of these people who are at tune with nature. You wouldn't think working out a calendar would be something within their ability, but clearly they were quite sophisticated to do it to this degree. Obviously, it was probably an effort over thousands of years, but even so, I mean, 54 days with 12 months, with correcting for the drift as well, is quite impressive.
Well, as soon as you become agrarian, you have to know the cycles of the year. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, you mentioned earlier that they didn't do a fantastic amount of planting of crops and things. However, they certainly did do some, of course.
Yeah.
So you need to know when's best to plant and when's best to harvest. Even the Mesopotamians, thousands of years before this, the Egyptians, of course, you have to know when's the height of summer and when winter's coming. It's a matter of life and death for your whole culture. So, you've got to be on top of it. You have to.
Thank you very much for watching that short clip from the full conversation, which can be found on the website underneath my Contemplations series. Thank you and goodbye.